Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Engage with Eagle Forum. I'm Tabitha Walter, the political director of Eagle Forum, and I'm joined by our host, Kirsten Hassler, our executive director.
Hi, everyone. There is so much going on right now in the news. Issues like the war in Ukraine, COVID, inflation, and gas prices are very important, but sometimes we miss other issues that we can act on right now. One of those is President Biden's nominee for the Supreme Court.
Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson was nominated at the end of February, and senators have been meeting with her to vet her credentials, characters, and intentions. But for most of us, we have some questions ourselves. That's why we have invited Keisha Russell to join us, who has done extensive research into Judge Jackson. Let me tell you a little bit about her. Keisha Russell is counsel with First Liberty Institute, concentrating on religious liberty matters and First Amendment rights. She attended Emory University School of Law, where she was heavily involved in Emory's prestigious Center for the Study of Law and Religion. She served on the Emory Journal of Law and Religion and 2 moot court teams. She was a law clerk for the Center's Restoring Religious Freedom Project, where she worked on religious liberty litigation. In her final year of law school, Keisha worked as a law clerk for the American Center for Law and Justice on national and international matters affecting Israel. Keisha was a 2017 Emory University Graduating Woman of Excellence. Previously, Keisha was a Teach for America Corps member in Atlanta Public Schools as an elementary special education teacher. Welcome to the podcast, Keisha.
Thank you so much for having me.
So for many of us, Judge Jackson's nomination was the first time that we heard her name. So can you tell us just a little bit about her?
Yeah, sure. I mean, she has a pretty impressive background. Certainly her credentials on paper are in line with many of the former Supreme Court justices and the current ones. She went to Harvard for undergrad and for law school. She started out her career as a judge on the DC Circuit District Court. She was there for about 7 years. And last year, she was nominated for the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. So she's been there for about a year. The DC Circuit is a common sort of feeder into the Supreme Court. So there are several judges that have ended up on the Supreme Court that were on the DC Circuit Court of Appeals.
Now, you have spent a lot of time looking into her past rulings and also her activism. How do you see her future rulings playing out based on what you've seen in the past?
So I think one of the biggest things that we've seen in some of her opinions is her reversal rate, which is pretty high for a federal judge. It's about 11%. So she's only written about 2 opinions as a judge for the Court of Appeals, but on the DC Circuit, she wrote quite a few. And so we looked at the amount of times when she had an opinion that she wrote that was subsequently appealed, and that court overturned her decision. And that happened at a rate of about 10 to 11%. And what we've seen is that the DC Circuit Court of Appeals is actually a lot of Democratic appointees. And so these are going to be people that, for the most part, share a lot of her philosophies and perhaps her worldview, but they still viewed some of her opinions as being judicial overreach or an abuse of discretion and things like that. And sometimes that is an indication that a judge participates in what a lot of Republicans call judicial activism. So what that really means is that they're willing to twist or misinterpret the law in order to reach a particular decision that they prefer politically, even if the law doesn't exactly justify that decision. What you can expect from her time on the Supreme Court are decisions that are in line with her predecessor, Justice Breyer. And most of the scholars have compared her writing and her judicial philosophy to Justice Sotomayor. So pretty liberal.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. And we've heard calls from the Biden administration for unification and, coming together. But he nominated a woman and a judge who is very partisan. So why do you think the president nominated her specifically?
Well, I think no matter what, Joe Biden, the president was not going to pick a judge that conservatives are going to be excited about. I mean, that's just not going to happen. But I think he felt like based on her credentials and her background, her position on the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, that in terms of her education, that put her in a pretty good position, at least on paper, right? And then she just had a hearing for the DC Circuit Court of Appeals only a year ago. And she was able to skirt through that nomination with, well, the confirmation, that is, with about 3 Republican votes. And so I think he felt like she was in the best position to go through another hearing since she was just in one a year ago. Mm-hmm. So I think that was probably why he picked her, because he thought she had the best, she was the most likely to get through the nomination unscathed.
Sure. Yeah. So what is that process going forward now with our senators?
So now what you can expect is her hearings are set to begin March 21st. And you can expect the Democrats to really praise her background, her Harvard education, her 8 years on the bench on one of the most powerful courts in the country, second to the Supreme Court, the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. It'll likely come up that she'll be the first Black woman on the Supreme Court. And the Republicans are probably going to focus on her judicial philosophy, you know, the way she interprets the role of a judge. Are judges allowed to, quote, make laws, as some Republicans will accuse Democratic appointees of doing? Or is her job just to interpret the law, the Constitution as written, the more conservative approach to judicial philosophy? Definitely that reversal rate is going to come up. And the Republicans are going to use that, I think, to demonstrate that she may be more prone to activism than she is to being a neutral arbiter of the law, which is what she's supposed to be as a judge. So I think that'll come up. But, you know, we just kind of have to remember that the Republicans really can't tank this nomination. So that's what you can expect. Now,
you had mentioned that, you know, she had went through a confirmation just last year, and some Republicans had voted for her. Now, if they decide to change their mind this time, are there legitimate reasons why they should change their mind for a Supreme Court nominee versus a lower court nominee?
Well, certainly they can say that obviously the Supreme Court is going to have a lot more power. A justice on the Supreme Court is going to have a lot more authority, and it's going to have the ability to secure a precedent for the entire country rather than just the DC Circuit, right, or the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. So I think that might be one way that some of those Republicans that voted for her the first time can try to get out of it this time. But as I mentioned, the Republicans really can't do much to stop this nomination. You know, as we know, the filibuster is no longer available for judicial nominees. And so, you know, it's not going to require the 60 votes that a filibuster would. It's just going to be a straight majority. And right now, the Democrats have that majority, the 50-50 or 50-50, and then Vice President Harris is the tiebreaker vote. So she doesn't need any of the Republicans to vote for her this time in order to survive the confirmation process. So I think the best bet for the Republicans here would be to use it as an opportunity to educate the American people about the proper role of a judge. I think it's something that a lot of people are not that well versed on and don't completely understand. And I think the Republicans can really do a lot of work and service to the American people by using it as an opportunity to educate them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe you can go in a little bit more on that, on the education aspect, but also, you know, something I didn't really realize until we were going through the Kavanaugh confirmations is that these nominees actually meet with the senators. They have interviews with the senators. So if you wouldn't mind, maybe you could talk a little bit about what's going on in the background. You know, we just see the external stuff, the outward facing, the committee hearings, but there's a lot of work happening on the inside.
Yeah, I mean, the process is pretty extensive. She meets with a lot of the senators. I think she did that last week. For the entire week, she met with a number of senators, and they'll really just question her about her judicial philosophy. They'll look at her opinion. Some of them are just wanting to get to know her and ask her about her life and the things she, cares about, things like that. It's not all business, but certainly most of it is going to be focused on what she believes the role of a judge should be. And I think, you know, as I mentioned, in terms of the education, that the Republicans really have to teach the American people what it means to be a judge. And I think, you know, we take for granted understanding the separation of powers, the fact that the judicial branch interprets the law, you know, the legislative branch makes the laws, and the executive branch enforces the laws. But I think constantly reminding the American people of why it's important for judges to stay in their role and not to be in a role of a legislature, that is to make something law from the bench when they don't really have the authority to do that. I think that's really important for people to understand why it helps us all when each branch of government stays in their lane, and we can prevent things from kind of going haywire. And, you know, I don't think everybody really truly appreciates that, because if a judge gives them the outcome that they want, like if the judge gives you an outcome that you want, even if it was wrong, you tend to, you know, overlook the fact that it wasn't that judge's authority to do so. And I think the Republicans could really take an opportunity to do that during the confirmation process.
Yeah, it's really hard to separate the legal aspects of it versus the political aspects of it, because this is a political nominee, and someone in politics is appointing and confirming and voting, and so, you know, when we watch those confirmation hearings play out, a lot of times we're really disappointed in the answers, because there's really no answer to these political questions. Can you kind of talk about that and what we should be listening for in those hearings?
Yeah, that's a great question. So remember that as a judge, Judge Jackson, even when Judge Barrett was being confirmed, those judges are not allowed to indicate how they would rule on a particular issue. And, you know, senators constantly asking judges about our most controversial precedents, like abortion and things like that. They can only give you general answers to that, because they can't tell you this is what I think should happen there. And also asking a judge how they interpret the Constitution. What is their role in making a decision about a particular controversy or a case? What are they supposed to do? What are they not allowed to do? What would they do if, say, for example, they were faced with a case where they felt like the outcome should be one way, in the interest of justice, say, for example, but law did not allow them to rule that way, that the case law did not allow them to rule that way, that they would really have to go against previous precedent to get the outcome they wanted? What would you do? Those are really good questions to ask a nominee, because then you get an idea of whether they're willing to skirt the law to get an outcome they want, rather than the outcome that they are supposed to provide as a neutral arbiter of the law. So those are some of the things you can listen for. I can bet she's not going to answer a lot of the questions we want to know about, say, what she thinks about abortion, for example, and those kinds of things. And she doesn't have to answer those, and she probably shouldn't, frankly. Now, we know the answer to some of those questions because of some of the groups that support her, and many of them are pro-abortion groups and things like that. And those groups don't support you unless they think you're favorable to their position. But regardless, the best way is to really question her future philosophy and how she perceives her role as a judge. That's the best way.
Thank you so much for that, Keisha. I was wondering if you could go a little bit in depth on what you think Judge Jackson's judicial philosophy will be.
Well, I think it's going to be like many of the liberal nominees on the Supreme Court. So obviously, conservative nominees are very concerned with originalism and textualism. And what that really means for your audience is just they're concerned with interpreting law according to the original meaning when it was written and the text of the law, that they don't feel like their role is to twist those interpretations. That's a very conservative way of interpreting the law, and many people will tell you that that's probably the most neutral. Mm-hmm. A more sort of liberal way of interpreting the law is saying that the Constitution is, quote, a living document. That means that the interpretation of the Constitution should change based on the culture, based on the new trends, based on how people feel about certain topics now. And it's likely, based on some of the things that we've seen, some of the groups that she supports, some of the amicus briefs that she's written as a lawyer, and certainly according to some of the opinions that were reversed, that Judge Jackson is likely to be on the more liberal side of that approach. She's more likely to interpret the Constitution as being a living document. Now, she was asked about that. And there was one time when I believe she said that she did think the Constitution was a living document. And then in her most recent confirmation hearing, she declined to really clarify her interpretation of that. But I think it's pretty safe to say that originalism and textualism is likely not the way that she will view judicial interpretation for the most part, that is. And like I said, many of the scholars that reviewed her opinion said that she was more akin to Justice Sotomayor, and that's a very liberal way of interpreting the Constitution. It's very culturally specific and dependent.
Yeah. So, for us in the States and for our listeners, how can our listeners stay informed, but also how can they make their voice heard? This is something, obviously we can ask our senator to vote no, but is there something more that we can do in the meantime?
Well, First Liberty has a lot of information on their website. So our website, firstliberty.org, you can go and get a lot of information. I mean, the best thing that you can do is to really stay informed and not be deceived by everything you hear in the media. I mean, there's just so much nonsense and a lot of noise. And most of the time, you'll walk away from it feeling very confused and overwhelmed. And so I tell people, just think about things pretty deeply before you believe things on face value. So you hear about this nominee, don't just take, the news's word for it, or even my word for it. Go look these things up for yourself. And some people will say, well, how do I do that? One of a really good way to make sure that you're getting a pretty thorough understanding of an issue, not just on a nominee, but on any issue, is to read competing news sources on that issue so that you can get both sides. And then most of the time you'll be able to interpret what the real story is. So read the most trustworthy liberal news, right? So that's going to be like your New York Times. And then also read your most trustworthy conservative news media. That's going to be Fox or National Review, and then something like the Wall Street Journal. When you read a wide variety of sources, you're going to come away with a pretty good understanding of the issue. So try to reserve judgment on things before you do thorough research, and understand if you've only heard one thing, if you've just read a headline, dear God, don't base any of your opinions on a headline. But if you just read a headline, recognize that you have limited information and try to refrain from reacting emotionally to that and forming an opinion based on just one sentence. Do your research before you form an opinion.
Yeah, that's good.
I love that. That's great life advice.
Mm-hmm.
Just in general, right? I mean, just don't read off of what someone says on Facebook. It's probably not true. Well, thank you so much, Keisha, for joining us today. This has been a really informative conversation. We will be sure to share all that information that you've talked about in the show notes and on our social media. If you're listening to our podcast, please make sure to subscribe and share with your friends. Thank you again for listening. From your house to the State House to the White House, this is Engaged with Eagle Forum.